the computer. Fantastic. So, any final questions before we start? Hello to Robert in Brussels. My goodness. We got quite a wide range of people. So Trev was born in Georgetown and attended Queen's College. He graduated with a BSc and also PhD and a PhD degree in chemical engineering from the University of Birmingham in England. From 1971 to 1979, he conducted research on petroleum upgrading for Amoco Oil Company in Chicago. He then spent 5 years working on catalytic coal gasification at the Coal Science Research Institute in Beijing, China. There he got married and started a family. Now living in Vancouver. Please make sure you've got yourselves on mute, everyone. I can hear somebody in the background. I think it's Cecil Chin, so I'm just going to remind you to mute. There you go. Okay, and then, so obviously he got married, started a family, and is now living in Vancouver. Trev wrote 3 books about the Chinese Guyanese, about their arrival in the 19th century, their experiences as settlers in Guyana, and also how their descendants fared as migrants to other countries. So, yeah, just a final reminder to mute. I'm just going to go through and check that everybody's on mute before we start, because I don't want it to interfere. So you should probably, a few of you will see a request. In fact, I might just press mute all and then just ask Trev to unmute, because, yeah, so mute all, so that should have worked. Trev, if you just unmute.
Yes, I think I'm okay.
You're okay? Okay, I'm gonna go on to speaker view now. I can see you. I'm gonna open up the PowerPoint. Shall I just go ahead and do that?
No, not yet.
Not yet. Okay, perfect. So whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Okay. Good morning or good day or good evening, wherever you are. Thanks, Juanita, for arranging this. It's a long presentation that I have, so let's get right to it. In January of 1979, I was presented this document by my cousin. It happens to be the contract of indenture of our great grandfather, dated 11th of December, 1873. So let's look at the contract indenture, Juanita. Okay, well, it's a little bit of fine print. So let's go down to the details, which next slide. The period of service is 5 years. Next, please. I shall not be required to work on Sundays. How considerate. Next, please. A day consists of 24 hours, and I may not be required to work more than 9.5 hours in one day. Next. I, the said coolie, now agree that my wages shall be $4 a month. Now, an introduction here of the term coolie. In the British administration, the term was applied to anyone who was a worker coming from Asia. In Guyana, it became a term associated with the persons from India, and people from China were called Chinese. Okay, so having received this document, it enlightened me a bit of our history, and I spent 12 years looking into the meaning of this and what how it affected us. So I'd like to share you on this journey, and I'll go back in time and spend a long time in China. All right, let's start in 1834. Please, slide, please. This is the year that Britain abolished slavery, and one of the results of this was that there was a shortage of labor in British Guiana, especially on the sugar plantations. Next, please. At the same time, in the same year, a Free Trade Act came into being, and it ended the monopolies of large companies. Next, please. The East India Company was founded a long time ago, and it was perhaps the largest trading company. It allowed, but free trade, the introduction of free trade now allowed anyone who had a boat to go into trade. The Industrial Revolution at this time was in full swing. And of course, lots of products to offer. Next, please. Now, from China's position, it was had a different view on what trade was. In the social order of things, scholars, and this included people, the literati, science, arts, medicine, were the most important people. Farmers grew food and workers produced things. But if you were a farmer, say, growing cabbages, and I were a worker making a cart, and we exchanged goods by trade, we were not increasing the common wealth. So that from the point of view of China, of the Chinese administration, you were not adding anything of value. You were just exchanging things. So when the foreigners came along and said, oh, we'd like to trade, they said, well, what do you want to trade? And so on. And so the emperor only allowed trade to carry on in a specific location. Now, by this time, tea had become a national drink of Britain. So let's go to where the action is. Next, please. This is the coast of China, and I want to look down. Very at the bottom is Canton. Up at the very near the top is Peking, and Peking is the seat of administration. Now, next, please. Oh, this is the Canton, the Pearl River, and the Canton is up in the upper reaches of the Pearl River. Hong Kong is at the opening of that river. And focus more on, let's go to the next. Now, this is the plan of Canton, and the number 2 that you can see at the bottom in the middle is where the factories were located. And the factories were where the foreigners were permitted to set up warehouses and do their exchange, their trade. And this is outside of the city of Canton. You can see the walls there very clearly. Now, China, or rather Britain, was paying for all these nice goodies with silver. So there was a huge trade deficit for the benefit of China. And while Britain was able to produce cotton, the Chinese didn't think very much of it because it was not as durable as hemp. So what could they offer to China? Maybe globes, or timepieces, or telescopes? How about cutlery? Maybe pianos or whiskey? Well, these didn't work. So the trade deficit was very much in favor of China. But more than a century earlier than the date we had mentioned, the East India Company had begun to introduce opium. And opium was considered a medicinal thing. But when the practice of smoking opium took hold, then we can see the next slide, it affected the population and it became an addiction. So now the emperor, the Chinese government had forbidden for a long time the introduction of opium. But as with dealing with any illegal drug trade, it's very hard to control. So China sent, or rather the emperor sent a commissioner, his name is Lin Sisi, and if we go to the next slide, he was appointed in 1839 to go and deal with this opium question. He blockaded Canton and called for all the opium to be turned over. On the opposite side, representing Britain, was Charles Eliot, who we see in the next slide. Charles Eliot was formerly the protector of slaves in British Guiana, and he was appointed superintendent of trade in June of 1836. Okay, I'll spotlight myself now. Now, Eliot asked that the opium stocks be turned over to him because he would then be in control of those goods. 21,306 chests of opium were given over to Commissioner Lin in June 1839, and he proceeded to mix them with lime and salt and let them out into the sea, with a warning to the creatures of the sea to be aware. Now, having seized all this opium and stopped the trade, Lin said, if you want to do legal trade with us, you must sign a bond to say that no opium is on board. Well, Elliot didn't have a similar agreement. So they began to gather warships. On the Chinese side, 29 warships went to the Pearl River Delta, and 2 British ships with 46 cannons appeared as well. In November of 1839, the Royal Saxon, which was a free trader, began to head to Canton with no opium on board. And the captain of the British contingent fired a shot across its bow. Well, the Chinese junks came to the rescue of the Royal Saxon, and the British response by Captain Smith was fire. Thus started the first Opium War. The Opium War was not one war. It was a series of clashes and peace intervals of peace that lasted for 21 years until a final resolution in 1860. There's a lot of nice intrigue there, but I can't go into that today. Now, let's go to, I'll show you here, the coast of China. And what the British decided to do was to send an armed group up the coast, and they tried to present a letter at Amoy, and it was rebuffed. So they sailed up all the way to Taku, which is up at the top here, and out, well, a little bit close to Peking. And they presented the letter, or I should say, it was received by a person called Qi Shan, who was the governor of the area at the time. Now, Qi Shan interpreted this letter as just some grievances. Let's do trade, let's be nice to each other, and so forth. So when he spoke to the emperor realized, well, Lin, who had taken away all the opium, was now had created war. So Lin was dismissed, sent into exile, and Qi Shan became the province and sent down to Canton to negotiate. But the approach of Qi Shan was, oh, let's take it easy. We don't need to rush into things. You know, you guys are, be nice. Flattery and courtesy and respect were the order of the day. So in spring of 1842, the battleship HMS Cornwallis sailed up to get action to resolve the matter. The Cornwallis had 74 guns and was accompanied by a few other warships. It headed, let's go again to the coast. Instead of going to Canton, it headed up the coast and captured Shanghai and headed up the Nanking River. It was about to bombard Nanking when a note came that the emperor wanted to have a discussion. Out of this, the Treaty of Nanking, which here is a slide, shows up as an agreement between the Chinese and do we have the slide up, Juanita?
Yes, we can bring it up.
Okay, no, next. This is the treaty. And one of the big things was that Hong Kong, and this is the birth of Hong Kong as a British property, was ceded to Britain in perpetuity. 5 ports were opened as trading ports, and China would now pay an indemnity for seizing the opium and also the war expenses that Britain incurred. Okay, now after this treaty was agreed to, not yet, please. After this treaty was agreed to, the foreign nations like America and Belgium and Sweden and Norway also gained similar privileges. But also, France got the permission to be able to promote Roman Catholicism in China. Now, there was a relative calm, excuse me. There was a relative calm for the next few years. But the big issue was opening Canton. While in Shanghai, they were opening their doors and you can come within the cities, Canton, the administration refused to let any foreigners, who were called barbarians, into their city. Of course, the British insisted in getting into the city. And Subsequently, some hardliners came into office in Canton, which just were absolutely unmovable. An emperor, the old emperor died, a new emperor came on, he's 21 years old, and he was also quite rigid in his views. So the British and French forces attacked Canton in December of 1857. Now, why were the French involved? Well, they'd just gotten a year earlier permission to send missionaries into China, but one of the missionaries went into a forbidden location and got killed. So now the French had some revenge that they wanted to execute. This attack on Canton led to an Allied administration, an occupation of Canton. British, French, and a local Chinese administrator were in charge of things. This went on without resolution, the open Canton question, until 1860, when the British and French sought to get matters resolved. In that year, 13,000 British and 7,000 French sailed north to confront the emperor in Peking. After some more stalling on the Chinese side, the Allies decided to sack the summer palace, which was called Yuan Ming Yuan. And here we can get the slide of Yuan Ming Yuan. This was considered the Versailles of the East, a massive place that was the favorite place of the emperor. So on October the 6th, Yuan Ming Yuan was pillaged for 2 days, looted, gold, silver, bronzes, jewelry, porcelain, cloisonné, artwork, furs, silks were all sent to Britain and to the Emperor Napoleon III in France. They set, because they didn't have enough time to really take everything, they set the place on fire. Next slide, please, and left the place in ruins. And it burned for 2 days. For two days of conflagration. Now, this resulted in the 1960 Convention of Peking, which permission for Chinese to emigrate was now allowed. And this will come up later in my talk. 10 more ports were allowed to be open. Foreign vessels were allowed to sail up the Yangtze River. Opium was made legal and taxable. And there was a ban on the Chinese calling foreigners barbarians. Besides this matter in dealing with foreigners, China had other problems. And let's go to the next slide. There was a person named Hung Siew-Quan, and he was of Hakka origin. Hakkas were people who had, over the centuries, had migrated south from the north. And they occupied the less fertile places in Guangdong and Guangxi, but they were very industrious and did well for themselves. Hung Siew-Quan was a failed scholar. He tried 4 times to become registered as a scholar in China, but failed. Then he fell into delirium, and after he came out of that, he started to read some translations of some Christian texts, which were handed to him by his cousin. He then came to the realization that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. He started an association of God worshippers in 1847. They gathered armies, marched north, and took Nanking, which became the heavenly capital. Now, the Taipings were opposed to opium, and they also considered women to be equals, and so no foot binding. Now, the Taipings didn't succeed for a couple of reasons. One was that the generals, which were named kings, were fighting one another well, they just didn't like one another, so they fought one another. And then the Taiping movement launched simultaneous expeditions to the north and to the west. And when you divide your forces like that, you get into trouble. Hung Siew-Quan died in 1864, and that caused the end of the Taiping Rebellion. And it is estimated that some 20 million people died in this activity. Now, with all this in perspective, let's see how the Chinese immigration fits in. Chinese were forbidden to travel abroad, but the Opium War showed the foreigners how they could get their way with China with the 3M approach. Merchants, backed up by the military, which paved the way for the missionaries. So in 1845, the French, which still had not abolished slavery, as well as the Spanish, not abolished slavery, took the first Chinese workers from Amoy to go to Reunion Island. Now, in September of 1851, George Booker, one of the Booker's brothers that you may know in Guyana, was willing to dispatch a ship called the Lord Elgin to get Chinese, while at the same time taking 146 Indians back to Madras. So having taken the Indians on a return voyage, on the 23rd of July, 1852, the Lord Elgin sailed from Amoy with 154 men and boys. Okay, now I'd like to bring in a world view, and let me see, can I put, yes, please. Now there's a string attached. It shows the journey of the thing. Now, here is the ships that have left the coast of China and gone down for a refueling supply in Singapore, and then taken a journey south of the equator, another refueling stop in the Cape, and then onwards to Guyana. This was half a world's journey. And of course, there would be rocky seas at times. So the journey was not always very smooth. Now, the ship that we were, the very first ship, that was me. The very first ship that sailed, the Lord Elgin, 4 people died on the way to Singapore. And then a leak caused seawater to get into the ship. It fermented the rice and generated hydrogen sulfide. 45 more people died. The mortality by the time they arrived in Guyana was 44.8%. The voyage lasted 177 days, and there were less people going into Georgetown than had left. That means the Indians that they had taken away. Let's look at the ships, please, and the next slide. The ships that were taking the next, please, and the next. All right. Yes, the ships that were taking the Chinese were clippers, and they found out. No, we should. No, you're going too far. Please go back.
Sorry about that.
And they found now that it was too expensive to bring Chinese, so they halted the program for a while. But in 1858, when the foreigners were getting their way with China, there was a committee called the West India Committee based in Britain, and it was a trade promoting organization that decided to send a person named Thomas Gerard to obtain Chinese immigrants. So he went over and acquired 2 ships and sent 704 males to British Guiana, and all happened to come from the Barracoons in Macau. Can we go to a slide, please?
Is this the right one?
No, above this.
Above it, okay.
Before this. All right, on the bottom of your picture is a building, and this was of the Barracoons in Macau. Now, these were people who were being taken off the streets, and the organization of getting Chinese immigrants onto foreign ships was a program of using crimps. Crimps were the local Chinese people who would acquire whoever they were able to get to go to board ships. Now, Rutherford Alcock, who was the British Consul General in Japan, wrote this in 1859. Let's see. Okay, when no man could leave his house, even in public thoroughfares and open day, without a danger of being hustled under false pretenses of debt or delinquency, and carried off a prisoner in the hands of crimps to be sold to the purveyors of coolies at so much a head, and carried off to sea, never again to be heard of, the whole population of the city and adjoining districts were roused to a sense of common peril. So in essence, the Chinese were being taken for the most part without, well, not voluntarily. Okay, so in 1859, when the Allies were occupying Canton, they attacked and occupied Canton that year, James Gardner Austin was sent to become the immigration officer. Now, he had been the immigration officer in British Guiana and now took up this new post. Now, he went to Hong Kong and was able to make a trip over to Macau, where he says he found that the war regarding the Barracoons in Macau, the lofty walls and clusters of guards in every direction told only but too truly that the buildings were well-conducted jails and the inmates but hopeless prisoners, shut out from all communications with friends and with the heavy head, heavy head of fate upon them for their future. So Austin recognized that this trade in Chinese persons was not what they were wanting. So next slide. He proposed a program which he posted a notice, which was translated in Chinese. And here are some details. Let's go to the next, please. There is no slavery where the British flag flies. Next. All Chinese may therefore go without fear to the British West Indies. And the next. The climate is very much like that of southern China. And next, please. The cultivation is chiefly that of sugarcane. Next. A free passage is offered and clothing for the voyage. So this is the program that Austin set up, but he was also instructed to get females. Now, the initial immigrants to British Guiana turned out to be quite welcome. In fact, let's see if I can find some things here. Yes. Here is about within 6 months of their arrival in 1853, some of the plantation owners were reporting about their how they were getting on. One said, "I am willing to take 50 to 100 more Chinese on the terms I got the first lot. And planters who may be displeased with their batch, I will gladly accept." This is from Mr. Trotman, who was at Plantation Blankenberg. Another person by the name of, is a manager named Butts, said, "A very useful class of people, exceedingly apt and intelligent and very willing, quite equal to coolies we are now receiving." And so Austin, yes. Austin acquired the help of the missionary William Lobshield, who is a medical missionary and got into good relationships with the Hakka. And so with this influence, they were able to get families to immigrate. So let's go to the next slide. This is a typical clipper that was being used to carry the Chinese. And the name of this one is called the Red Riding Hood. And it took 3 voyages to Guyana, 1860, 1861, and 1862, taking a total of 954 Chinese. Now, the reason why it made 3 journeys was because it had a contract to take Demerara sugar to Britain. Now, these shipments of Chinese continued until 1866, and then disagreements came and the program was halted because they couldn't iron out. The Taiping, the Opium War was now over, but the British and I should say the foreigners and Chinese were still in disagreement of how to deal with immigrants. The British were willing to take them for 5 years internship. The French wanted 7 years and the Spanish wanted 10 years. So nobody got to a complete agreement of what to do. So the program of bringing Chinese into Guyana halted for a while. But then in 1874, a ship called the Corona, which was my great-grandfather's ship, took the last ship carrying Chinese that held indentured documents, indentured labor contracts before boarding the ship. Following the arrival of the Corona, the economic conditions, for example, depressed price of sugar or reducing subsidy for bringing the Chinese from China came into being. And it was later on in 1878 that 31 plantation owners put up funds to charter a ship to bring Chinese workers without contracts. And the Dartmouth arrived in March of 1879 with 515 free immigrants. A large number of them were Christian converts, including members of the Hung clan who were associated with the Taiping Rebellion. Overall, there were 39 ships that took 13,541 Chinese between the years 1853 and 1879. The voyages lasted between 70 and 177 days, and in total, 15% of the immigrants were females. Okay, I wanted to introduce another subject that might be closer to you in present day. And here we have, I'm going to focus on myself. Let's look here. On the contract of indenture, you're able to see that the name is signed in English, it's Sue-A-Quan. But if you were to go to the Chinese writing itself, his name is actually Su-Ya-Chang. Su-Ya-Chang. So how come this name got changed from Su-Ya-Chang to Sue-A-Quan, Sue-A-Chang, and written at the top? Well, now let us go to the slide. Now, my great-grandfather's name, Sue-A-Chang, became Sue-A-Chang, and his son, who he brought with him on the vessel, was Su-Sam-Quan. But now let's go back a little bit. In English, we have a way of putting the phrase E behind a name to make it more familiar. For example, you get mom becoming mummy and dad becoming daddy, and you have Annie and Johnny and so forth. In Chinese, you put an A in front of the given name. So Su is a clan name or surname. Quan in the second line that you see would be the personal name or given name. So they would call the son A-Quan, and that morphed into the name Sue-A-Quan, which became the surname for our family in Guyana. Next slide, please. So this produced a whole lot of names with A in the middle, double hyphenated A names, as you can see. A lot of them you may know, Chia Tao and Fung-A-Fat and Fung, oh my goodness, Lao Chi and Hoa Shu, Wunatai, and so forth. So if you were ever to see a person with the name having an A as a double hyphenated name, there's a good chance that this person is from Guyana. Next slide, please. There were also some names that were kept as the whole name. So Chongtan, Phuc, and Hotem, Pa, Mansenhing were all names that were the original names from China, and they became retained in Guyana. All right, thanks. Next. So what I've been reading to you and presenting to you has come from my book, Cane Reapers, which describes the history and reasons for why the Chinese went to British Guiana. The second book is called Kin Ripples, which was their experiences while working and living in Guyana. And the third is Cane Rovers, which is stories of their experiences as immigrants to other countries in the world. The first and third books are available on Amazon, but you'll have to contact me to get the middle book. So that concludes my presentation, Juanita. I probably overran quite a bit.
No, that's absolutely fine. Thank you so much. And if you are on gallery view, you may be able to see the audience. I would love everyone to put their hands together. I don't want to hear you, but I'd love to see you clapping your hands at the screen as a huge thank you to you. Trev, that was absolutely splendid. I have to say, I had no idea that there was a difference. Well, first I didn't know that there were free immigrants that had come, I think you said in 1879. Yeah, so I'd always sort of wondered about that transition from indentureship into just owning their own stores and moving away from the plantations. And that sort of kind of hints at how some of that may have happened. But we'll ask you more specific questions at the end. I'm going to let everybody else, we're going to move on to Laura's presentation. But yes, really, really deeply honored to have had you share all that amazing knowledge with us, Trev. So thank you so very much. Okay, I'm going to look for Laura now. Laura, can you just say your name so I can see where you are?
Here I am.
I'm okay. I just want to pin you there so I don't lose you. Let me see how I do that. Hold on a second. Okay, I think we're good. So you should be pinned to the screen. So everyone, if you go on speaker view, you'll automatically see Laura now. And just to give Laura's introduction, Laura is an independent researcher living in the USA. Her main interest is in the Chinese in Guyana, which was her topic of dissertation. The Chinese in Guyana, the making of a Creole community. And that was written for her PhD in ethnic studies at the University of California, Berkeley. She has taught at UC Berkeley and the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. She has published essays on various aspects of the Chinese in Guyana. Her mother's family is descended from Chinese men and women who were brought to Guyana as indentured laborers in the 1860s to work on the sugar plantations. And she'll be sharing insights into the fortunes of Jacob Fung-A-Pan and Abigail Young-Shi, I think. So I'm going to hand that straight over to you, Laura. And do you want me to just bring up your PowerPoint straight away, or?
Yes, you can bring up the first slide.
Bring it up. Okay. Everybody, please, again, just make sure you're on mute. And I won't be a second. I just need to make sure I've got Laura's PowerPoint up. Okay. I think we are set to go. Just go on the first one.
That's the last one.
Yeah, here we go. There we are.
Okay.
Over to you, Laura.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Juanita, for organizing this, and thanks, Trev, for doing the historical background. I should just like to talk a bit about how I came to doing this. I mean, as Juanita mentioned, my mother's family is from Chinese family in Guyana. And when I first went to Berkeley, I wasn't going to do my research on the Chinese in Guyana. I had a completely different topic in mind, but this was in the early 1980s. And you remember the card catalogs in the library. And I thought, well, I'll just see what there is on the Chinese in Guyana. And flicking through the card catalogs, I found only 2 items. There was a book by Cecil Clementi written in 1913 on the Chinese in Guyana, which is still probably the seminal book on the background to how the Chinese got to China. And one article written in the 1950s by an anthropologist. And his conclusion was that these people are not really Chinese at all. So I was quite indignant to read that. And it piqued my interest. And later on, I switched my topic of my dissertation, and I decided to do it on the Chinese in Guyana, because I just realized there needed to be more from people who had access to that community and were interested in presenting it from their point of view. So I wrote my dissertation, which encompassed quite a bit of the history that Trev has talked about, and a lot of theoretical stuff and so on. I went to Guyana with my mother and we scoured the archives and so on. But when I finished, my mother said, well, you haven't mentioned us. How about our family? And I said, well, you didn't write anything, or you didn't know, I don't have any documents. I can't put anything in a dissertation that doesn't have any documents. So that prompted me, after I'd finished my dissertation, to do another article looking into my mother's family. Well, where to start? And by then it was the 1990s. And fortunately, the digitization of newspapers had started. And the Daily Chronicle, the late 19th century, was available in digital form. And I could type in people's names and actually find material, find articles about people. So unfortunately, the Chinese mostly appeared in the columns about crime, which, as you can imagine, it doesn't tell you too much. There's usually a couple of lines. So when Wang Chi was sentenced to prison for stealing plantains or something, or so-and-so was put in prison for beating his wife. But I typed in the names of my 2 ancestors who I knew emigrated on 2 of those ships that Trev talked about. And lo and behold, articles came up about them, which I was very surprised. Jacob Fung-A-Pan and Abigail Young Shi. And unfortunately, it was because Jacob Fung-A-Pan became a bankrupt insolvent, and Abigail was murdered. So their cases came to be in the newspaper. And unfortunately, I do not have any photos of them. There are no known photos of these ancestors, but so I've put up these photos of some of the Chinese merchants, I assume, because they're very nice portraits of well-dressed people that appear on the UK National Archives Flickr site. If you type in a search for Guyana on the UK National Archives, there's a collection, there's the UK National Archives Guyana collection, and almost the first photo is this photo, along with other portraits of other ethnic groups. It's sort of someone did a sort of anthropological or ethnological collection of photos, but it's rather nice selection there. And I imagine that maybe Jacob and Abigail might have looked a bit like this. You can see on the far right is a lady with bound feet. So she definitely came from China, because the practice of binding feet did not continue, of course, in Guyana. And very few of the women who came over had bound feet, and it was usually noted in the immigration notes if they did. So I'm just going to talk a bit about Jacob and Abigail. I'm not going to read my article. I can put a link to it later, and it's been on Guyana Speaks, the link before, but I'll put it again for those who are interested. But I want to just talk about them and a bit about the person who murdered Abigail. So, as I said, there was very little about Jacob and Abigail except in the newspaper. His story is not unusual for that period. He came on the Whirlwind ship in 1860. That happened to be the first ship that had Chinese females. So it was quite notable because everyone was very happy that Chinese had managed to send, or they had managed to bring Chinese female immigrants, which meant that you could have a population of families that would reproduce themselves because the colony was interested in growing the population available for work on the plantations. The Whirlwind had Jacob Fung-A-Pan, and Jacob was listed as, let's see, just give a description of him. So he was 5'2". He came from a village, Punyi, which is now a suburb of Guangzhou. And according to my sister who lives in Hong Kong at the moment, she says Punyi has a large golf course. So, he elected to have some of his very small wages assigned to his parents in China. So there was some connection retained through these small remittances to China. But I think over a period of time that became lost because unlike the Indian immigrants, Chinese did not get a return passage to China.
I see the apple pie. What a big, large apple pie. What are you going to do with all that?
Bruce Nobriger, I know that's your voice there. Please go on mute.
I just say she asked me how old I said, how old do you think he is?
I'm going to stop sharing for a second.
Yeah.
How I laughed.
Somebody, yes, we have somebody talking in the background there.
Right, you got to go to spectator.
Okay, I've muted everyone, so if you can unmute yourself, Laura. Thank you.
Okay, yes. I heard someone talking about apple pies there.
That'll be Bruce. But,
So Jacob was, his occupation was listed as peddler. This is one of the complaints of the estate management, the plantation owners, was that the Chinese were sending them a bunch of city sweepings, you know, the people swept off the street. Now, it's true that very few of the men listed their occupation as farmer or agriculturalist, because in China, there was so little land that most people could not make a living off the land. If they had some land, the women and children and the old people would be the ones who would work the land, and the men would go off to the cities and sell handicrafts that their family made at home, and they'd come back for harvest time. So the occupations that are listed on the for the Chinese immigrants are, you know, things like servant, butcher, flour maker, cowherd, all kinds of other occupations, but very rarely agriculturalists, because if they were successful agriculturalists, they wouldn't have emigrated to Guyana. That's probably, you know, pretty clear. Now, Jacob's wife, Abigail, I'm going to call them Jacob and Abigail rather than by their Chinese names. Abigail came on a ship the next year, 1861, and she was listed as the wife of the interpreter, who was Ming, which was quite interesting because after that, there's no evidence that he and she had any relationship. It's quite possible that Ming paid Abigail to come as his wife, because men would get a bounty if they came with a wife. So that's quite possible that she just signed up and said, okay, I'll come along as your wife, but I'm not having anything to do with you after we get there. And then soon after she arrived, it seems that she and Jacob met, and they had about 11 children. 9 of them survived into their adulthood. And then at some point in 1879, they both were baptized. And Juanita, can we have the next? So this is the 2 pages from the baptismal register at St. Saviour's Church. And you may not be able to see it very well, but Abigail is the 3rd from the bottom. No, yes, Abigail's the 3rd from the bottom on the right-hand page, Chung Shi, because her name was Chung Shi. And Jacob is on the left-hand page, the second one from the bottom, Jacob Fung-A-Pan. His full name was Fung-A-Pan. And so his surname or family name is Fung, a very common name. There are many Fungs in Guyana. Not all are related. And here it gives a character. So if you know which character it is, there are several different Fungs of different origins. For instance, the catechist was Fung, but he was the catechist Fung who was descended from some of the Taiping kings, but this is a different family. So Jacob and Abigail got baptized at the St. Saviour's, which was a church established by the Chinese with their own money in Georgetown. Those of you who are familiar with Georgetown may know St. Saviour's on Saffron Street. It was a sort of sub-church, if you will, of St. Philip's. So they shared a pastor with St. Philip's Church. Excuse me. And it was, St. Saviour's was really the center in many ways of the Chinese establishment, or the Chinese middle class in Georgetown. From the 1874 onwards. 1874 was when it was established. So I'll go back to Jacob. His career, I would say, sort of encapsulates many of the career paths of other Chinese who eventually ended up as shopkeepers. Shopkeeper is such a general word, as you know. Shopkeeper can mean anything from managing one small shop to having several shops, and then after that, perhaps being a merchant. And Jacob really traversed this whole spectrum. He probably started after his indenture period, which was probably finished, I think he served 2 terms. So by 1868, he finished his 2 terms of indenture. And then he became probably a clerk in someone's shop on the plantation. And then eventually he was able to save enough to buy licenses to have shops, several shops around the area around Georgetown. Can we have the next image? Yeah. So just to give you some context, here's a map of Georgetown and the surrounding areas. And I've put numbers at the approximate sites of interest here. So Montrose was where he served his first term of indenture, number 1. And then he had a shop at Success, which makes sense because that's just a few plantations away. He bought a shop from someone called Samuel Chung. And then later he got shops at Providence and LaGrange, one on each coast of the Demerara River there. And then another one at Enterprise, further along the east coast. So you may wonder, how did he manage all these shops? Well, having a big family is where this helps. He had a large family, as I said, and at least 3 of his sons, as they got of age, would help him manage these shops. And then I think he hired other people to help manage others, because you can see he couldn't possibly be in all these places at the same time. He probably had bought and sold other properties. I don't know, I'm not sure, but these are the ones that I could find records for. So at some point, he's successful enough that he could enter into a partnership with 2 other Chinese men, Loa Yan and Fung-A-Ling, which is a familiar name maybe to some of you. Both of them Chinese immigrants themselves from China. They'd come on different boats, different ships than Jacob. So the 3 of them started a larger shop in Georgetown. And unfortunately, they started at a time when the sugar economy was in decline. Price of sugar had gone down, or something like that. So their shop was always struggling. They would have borrowed from other Chinese merchants. I know that at least a lot of their debt was from a big Chinese merchant called Hing Chong. And these larger Chinese merchants often made loans to small shops. And, that was one of the ways in which they helped each other out. But the other side of that is, if you didn't pay your debts, then, people could make a claim, the companies could make a claim on you. So eventually, these, do I hear a cock crowing? Something in the background there. Eventually, Jacob's own fortunes begin to decline a little. He begins selling his properties. Let's see, next image, Juanita, yeah. So in 1891, he transfers one of his properties to somebody called Chung Fu Cha. And you can see in here, this is how difficult it is to do research on a specific name, because his name is written Fung-A-Pao, P-A-U, which is incorrect. And his son, who is Fung Tin Young, is, I assume, one of the witnesses, who's written as F.L. Young. Trev was talking about the difficulty of the variations of names. So for example, Fung Tin Young, who was Fung-A-Pan's son, and Jacob and Abigail's son, his name appears in records sometimes as Fung, sometimes as Ten Yong, sometimes as Yong, and sometimes just as Isaac Fung. Isaac was his baptized name. And the gentleman below F.L. Yong there is Samuel Seth. That doesn't look like a Chinese name, but I happen to know it is a Chinese name, an interesting family, and a completely off the topic, but their family was Chinese who ended up in Singapore, but that's a whole other story. So anyway, the Loa Yan enterprise begins to unravel. Loa Yan and Co., the business of the 3 men, is held together by the 3 of them, and Loa Yan is the main partner. He dies in 1892, and everyone goes into bankruptcy. let's see, I think I need the, oh yes, I've got that one. Image 5, the next image, please. Yes. You can just see here, it's just a page from the BG directory, 1891. And Lower Yan's business is listed there on the far right column, and on the far left column, because it happens to be alphabetical and so they're on the same page, as Hing Chong and his company. And you can see they have quite a number of employees each. Soon after this, however, as I said, Lower Yan dies and the whole company goes into bankruptcy. And this is how I came to find out about Jacob, because the bankruptcy went through the court system as they divided up the assets. And then there was a lawsuit by Lower Yan's widow against the other partners and so on. So lawsuits are, you know, a misfortune, but for historical records, they're pretty useful because you get to find out things about all these people that you might, details you wouldn't otherwise not find out. Well, when it came to Abigail, usually it's very difficult to find out anything about the Chinese women because the men are the ones who are the business people or whose name might enter into the records. But as I said, Abigail was murdered. We have the next slide. Yes. And oh, this is Fung-A-Pan's insolvency. And he was, yes, we'll go to the next slide. Yes, so this is the first I found, the first thing I ever found about Abigail, my great-grandmother, murdered in Charlestown. But to go back, she came on a ship in 1860s, so she was I think 49 at the time of this misfortune. And it really was a misfortune. She happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had set out that morning to go do some shopping at Woley's provision shop in on Lombard Street. And there's next slide, I think. Yes, next slide. Thanks. Right. So Woley was a big Chinese merchant, sold all kinds of things, trinkets, but also provisions and food and so on. And on her way home from Woley, she was attacked by this Chinese person, Yip Pao, who stabbed her as she was walking home with her little granddaughter in hand. Everyone saw the crime. He didn't try to hide it. He just attacked her right there in the street. Everyone was very shocked. So the story of her attacker is one that intrigued me because very little is known about him. And I couldn't find out anything except what appeared in the court records, because of course, soon after he was arrested right away. And then there was a trial and court case that was written up in the newspaper because it was sort of a sensational case. So like many immigrants, Yip Pao must have come as an indentured laborer. I don't know which plantation he went to. I don't know which ship he came from because it's difficult to find out exactly from that name which person he might have been on the indentured records. After his indenture, it seems that he was just wandering from plantation to plantation doing casual work. And he worked for a very short while for Fung-A-Pan, Jacob Fung-A-Pan. And then he was, I think he was fired or let go. But it was a very brief period. And as you know, Jacob had several shops. He might not have even personally had much interaction with Yip Pao, but Yip Pao remembered Jacob and he had this grudge against him. So several years after his employment by Jacob, he decided to go searching for Jacob Fung-A-Pan because he was convinced he owed him some money. And so he walked all over the East Coast and the East Bank of the Demerara, the plantations around there, looking for Jacob. And finally, he ends up in Georgetown. And I don't know whether he recognized Abigail as the wife of Jacob or whether it was just random chance. I suspect he might have recognized her, but anyway, he went up to her and asked her for a penny to buy bread. And if she did recognize him, maybe that's why she did not give him a penny to buy bread. And he stabbed her after that and tried to stab the child. And people intervened, but it was too late because he'd stabbed her pretty hard. The trial, of course, found Yip Pao to be guilty. There wasn't any argument about that. And he didn't seem to have a lawyer or offer any defense, and he didn't say much. But what he did say, and what everyone said about him, seemed to indicate that he was suffered from what we would call some mental problems, psychological problems, perhaps schizophrenia, we might say now. And so he was sentenced to death, which was the normal sentence for anyone committing murder. And Yip Pao is of interest legally because I think he's the first person to ever have his sentence commuted on the grounds of insanity. This had just been introduced in the UK, that if someone had committed a crime and they were judged insane, the sentence could be commuted on the grounds of insanity. So somebody took this up in Georgetown, said this man was clearly insane. And the governor commuted his sentence and he was taken to the insane asylum at Berbice, New Amsterdam, that many of you may be familiar with, having lived there. And I don't mean as an occupant, but everyone knows where it is. So these three people had quite different fortunes. Jacob was left to raise at least 5 children who were still under the age of 18. As far as I can see, he didn't do much work after that. His son, Isaac Fung-A-Pan, became a very successful businessman. Can we have the next slide?
Laura, can you, just so that you know, I think we're going a little bit over. If you could wrap up in 5 minutes or so.
Yeah, I can do that.
Perfect.
Yeah. Oh, this is the map of Georgetown. I did put the map up, and you can see this is Work and Rust, where most of the actions I just spoke about, the murder, and the place that Jacob and Abigail lived. It was close to, it was on High Street, opposite that place that's labeled Carnegie Trade School. The map is actually from the 1960s, but the streets are the same. Next slide. Okay, so their son, Isaac Fung-A-Pan, became a very successful merchant in Georgetown. He owned many properties, bought and sold properties, and had even a small coconut plantation up near Suddy and a couple of other properties, one at Big Hanover near, I think about where Timeri Airport is now. He died in 1939 and had a large family who are scattered around the world. He had many compatriots who had a similar turn, similar success as merchants. I just wanted to focus on, just give you a taste of some of the variety of activities Chinese undertook. They were not just merchants. The second generation, like Jacob's son Samuel, trained as a lawyer, went to Singapore. Can we have the next slide? One of the most successful Chinese, who was also a friend of Feng Tianyang, was Evan Wong and his family. And this is the Evan Wong family. And his son, Robert Victor Evan Wong, who's there at the top left, another successful businessman. But he also entered politics. I think Stanley Ming can talk about that intersection too of businessmen and politics. He, in 1928, was appointed to the executive, let's see, next slide, yes, Executive Council, 1928. And this was probably the first Chinese person to be at such a high level of government. And then later on, let's see, next slide. Yes, of course, the Chinese community took great pride in that. So the Chinese Association made this plaque to honor R.V. Evan Wong and his great achievement there. Can we have the next slide?
I just want to mention, I like that he's referred to as a true sportsman as well, because
Yes.
that echoes with Stanley Ming as well. But
yes, right, a loyal friend, a true sportsman. Yes, and this is the Legislative Council. And R.V. Evan Wong, Robert Victor Evan Wong, is on the far right there. Then in 1934, he actually ran for the as an elected official to serve in the Legislative Council for the area, for the district of Leguan. That was when the previous member had unfortunately died. And he won the election, but it's interesting, the contender, the other contestant, challenged the results. And so there was a long trial, hundreds of witnesses. Does this sound very familiar? Election result contention. And they had to rerun the election, and R.V. Evan Wong won again definitively. Not such a big margin as the first time, but he did win that seat. So I will tie up my presentation there. Sorry to cut it off right so abruptly, but as you can see, there's a lot to say and to know about the Chinese in Guyana. I've been mainly talking about, Trev and I have been mainly talking about the historical part and people in the past, and turn it over to you, Juanita. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Laura. Again, if we can all go on gallery view and just put our hands together to show our appreciation for that. That was wonderful and fascinating, you know, just to hear about murder in Georgetown. It's quite intriguing, but also just focusing on the families and hearing the range of successes it was really interesting. And so now for our last speaker, last but no means least, I want to turn to Stanley, and I'm going to see if I can spotlight Stanley. I'm going to see if I can bring it up. Here we go. Stanley's there. Add a spotlight. Should all be able to see him. I'm going to take the pen out of Laura's. Oh, no, I don't want you to not be able to join. Remove spotlight. There we go. We should be on Stanley. Perfect. Okay, Stanley. It's wonderful to have you here. Thank you for joining us. And I'm just going to read through your bio. I'm sure you don't really need an introduction, because as someone who's living and working in Guyana at the moment, certainly you have a very high profile, but I'm going to read it. Stanley Ming was born in Georgetown in 1951 and attended Queen's College. He decided to forego further education in order to financially support his family. His first job as a Yamaha salesman at T. Geddes Grant increased his passion for motorcycles and motorcycle racing. He was to become the renowned winner of the Caribbean Motorcycling Champion for 4 consecutive years and participated at circuits in the UK and America. He was president of the Guyana Motor Racing and Sports Club, I believe in 2000-2001, a national committee member for Special Olympics Guyana, a founder committee member for Habitat for Guyana, Habitat for Humanity in Guyana, and he's also the founder and trustee of the Guyana Foundation. He entered politics in 2001, serving as an MP in various capacities until 2006. He is the well-respected and successful businessman, founder and CEO of Ming's Products and Services Limited, as well as Ithaca Construction and Engineering, Inc. He serves as chairman on the board of directors, Guyana Geology and Mines Commission. He will be sharing his knowledge of the new Chinese who have migrated to Guyana over the last 30 years. So, welcome, Stanley. Can we start off by talking a little bit about your background? I mean, I know you're what I would call a cook-up rice, mix up. But can you tell us something about the Chinese side of your ancestry?
First of all, Juanita, I must say thank you very much for having me on your program this morning. I learned a lot within the last 45 minutes. I must tell Trevor that I have all 3 of his books. I have to find a way of getting Laura's book. And I have the one from Clementi, and I have from my in-law, Marlene Cook Crawford. So I have a lot of catching up to do on the history. But with regards to my background ancestry, I did an ancestral test about a year ago in the United States. And I'm supposed to be Chinese and East Indian, 63.5%, Southern European, Spanish and Portuguese, 13.9%. West African 13.5 and Indian 7.8. When I added that up, it became 98.7. So I'm wondering where the 1.3 has gone. But when people ask me what I consider my my ethnicity to be, I tell them, which my brother coined many years ago, mixed chow mein. And and I was told not too long ago, a few months ago, there's a new one, a new designation for people like me. It's called Mixinese.
Mixinese, that's very good. Thank you for sharing that. So can I ask, as an entrepreneur who's actually based in Guyana, you must have seen many changes over the years. Can you tell us what actually triggered the second wave of Chinese immigration to Guyana in the, I guess it's like late 1990s? That's correct.
It was in the mid-90s, Juanita, and I have met with most of the people that have come back in business. And what they have been involved in is quite fascinating. Like many other of the various people that have come to Guyana over the years as immigrants, they're involved now, I can tell you, in gold mining, in forestry, in trading. In terms of trading, they import a lot of machinery, a lot of hardware, a lot of construction supplies, clothing, and they have established a lot of supermarkets within the last 30 years, right across Guyana. There are some big companies like Bosai, major mining company out of China. They're involved in bauxite and more recently manganese. There are teams that have come from China, medical teams. And there are a few companies that have come here that have been involved in shade house farming, which is, the new technology, not using too much of land space, but using very controlled climatic conditions to get maximum productivity from whatever they grow.
That's fascinating. So I'm just curious, actually, given that Trev was sort of talking about the Chinese, I guess they're from the hacker community. I'm wondering where do most of the Chinese in this modern migration, where do they mostly come from? What area of China?
Most of them come from the southern part of China at the present time, mainly the Guangdong province. and more specifically Guangzhou. And they're basically traders. It's very close to Shenzhen. And they come here and they apply their trade, more trading now than anything else, and some investment, as they said, in gold, forestry to some extent as well. There's a lot of involvement in timber.
So are there particular companies that are scouting for Chinese labor, or, what are the actual main companies or main contracts that have led to their presence?
Again, what has happened, Juanita, is you have some very big companies that are well known throughout the world. And, a country like Guyana, with the wealth of resources that we have, has been attracting a lot of attention, even before we found oil within recent times. And I can tell you that back in 2013, I think it was, or even before that, you had companies like China State Construction and Engineering Corporation. It's the biggest, one of the largest companies in the world. To give you an idea, their contracts that they have done worldwide over the last 20 odd years, triple in size compared to Bechtel, which is the largest American construction company. And I remember the last figure I saw, which was maybe 2 years ago, they had about $150 billion worth of contracts around the world. And they have built a lot of major things that we know about. We may not know it's them. For instance, the islands in Dubai, they were the ones that pumped all of that material to create the islands. They've built things like the railway station in New York for the New York Yankees. And you have China Railway Construction is another big company here that is present here. Those are the guys that did the Timeri Airport. They did the movie Town, and they're now finishing off the construction of the new convention center and the extension to the Pegasus Hotel. Prior to that, you had Shanghai Construction, which built the Marriott Hotel. And you now have also China Sino Hydro, which is the company that's doing the Sherry Street Mandela new 4-lane roadway. And you had China Railway Construction that did the East Coast Road from just past Plaisance all the way up to Mahika. So there's a lot of major companies here, and there are lots of small companies as well. I wouldn't go into those details, but China has, with a 1.4 billion people, and all of them looking to try to find jobs and contracts around the world. It is no wonder that China is in almost every country in the world doing something major in terms of construction or setting up manufacturing plants or whatever.
So, what have been the main benefits of their presence? Because I know people often wonder about, especially when immigrants come in, people talk about immigrants taking over roles that maybe Guyanese could have done or that kind of thing. But I wanted to know what's actually been the real benefits of having Chinese investment in Guyana or Chinese labor in Guyana?
Well, there are lots of perceptions and lots of different realities, Juanita. The Chinese, like many other persons from other parts of the world, are very advanced in today's world compared to countries like Guyana, who are still considered third world. The Chinese within the last 30 years, and I've been there many times within the last 30 years, all around China. I've been to the places that people don't normally go, like places like Tangshan, where they grow a lot of rice. I've been to Shijiazhuang, which is a very, used to be a very polluted city in manufacturing. Kunming, which is in the south. And the usual places, Beijing, Shanghai, looking at what they have achieved. And what I have discovered, my fascination, is that within the last 30 years, after the movement away from the communist ideology and practicing more or less what is capitalism and whatever term they use it, is that they have made progress leaps and bounds and have taken out hundreds of millions of Chinese out of poverty. And how they've done it is using education and new technology. And those companies coming to Guyana bring with them a lot of capital, a lot of new technology, And what they have been doing to some extent, not as much as I think could be done, is transferring a lot of that knowledge by working closely with Guyanese in Guyana and in many other countries like Jamaica, where they come with their expertise. They work alongside well, not in the trenches, but underground with the locals, teaching them the new systems and the new methodologies using new materials. So I think everywhere the Chinese have gone within the last 30 years has seen a new influx of technology, capital, and new ways of doing things in a more futuristic and modern way. Guyana is no exception to that.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. So there is a benefit in terms of transfer of knowledge. I'm just wondering, in terms of culture and in terms of how they live, have they become integrated into Guyanese society? And also, I'm just interested, how do the Guyanese feel about their presence?
Well, it's a catch-22 here, Juanita, because what happened is that a lot of the Chinese who come, the older ones that is, are not bilingual, and it takes them a long time to learn the English. And like many Guyanese, like myself, I think I could come from 1 to 5 in Chinese, and that's about it. So we have a major barrier to developing strong personal relationships because of lack of communication. However, what has been happening is that a lot of the families that have come here in the 90s have gotten children in Guyana, and they were born as Guyanese. And I mean, I have been in many places over the last 30 years, and if you don't see them, you would think it's the Guyanese that is speaking. They have all the raw slang which they know, and it's fascinating to see how they integrate with the younger generation of Guyanese. But the older ones, we have a problem because we don't communicate readily. And, you know, at times it will appear to the majority of us that the Chinese are being antisocial or we are being unfriendly. But in the case that we can't communicate as well as we should. But what I know is that efforts are being made now at the University of Guyana and some of the private schools, including the school just across from where my business is, Nations, that are offering Chinese as a language that you can learn. So I'm hoping that in the interest of not just Guyana or China, but, you know, all of us here in Guyana, because, you know, we're made up of the original slaves that came from Africa, or indigenous Amerindians. We have the Indians that came from India, Chinese as well that came, and the Europeans. So I think it will be a tremendous plus if efforts are made to make English more readily available to the Chinese to learn, and in some way our younger generation to learn Chinese, because if 1/5 of the world population is Chinese and they're the ones that are driving a lot of economic activities around the world, it would be in our interest to learn their language as well, so that when we negotiate with them, we can hear exactly what they're saying in their own language.
No, that's really fascinating. When you say to speak Chinese, what is the main language? Are they speaking Mandarin, or I guess it's not Cantonese? Cantonese, maybe? I don't know. What's the main? Do you know what the main language is?
Mandarin.
Mandarin. Okay.
Yeah.
And so that's what they're actually teaching in these private schools.
As far as I'm aware, yes.
Yeah. And has it led to any Guyanese actually going to China? I mean, are there any sort of bilateral relationships whereby they're going to China for their education or even for business?
There are quite a few Guyanese that have gone within, I would say, the last 20 years in exchange programs with universities in China. In fact, I have a few friends who are quite fluent now in Chinese. And they go mainly for, you know, scholarships that are provided by the Chinese government, as far as I know. In terms of business, lots of Guyanese businessmen. I've gone there several times over the last almost 30 years to the trade shows and to meet manufacturers of various commodities that we are interested in here in Guyana. There's a lot of new machinery in the rice industry. You know, China grows, as you know, China has 11% of the world's arable land with 20% of the population. So they have to produce, in terms of capacity, twice as much as any other nation in the world to feed their people. So they've developed a lot of very, very fascinating methodologies and systems for getting maximum production out of whatever they grow. I mean, for instance, like in the case of rice, I can tell you that we get about 1.5 tons of rice from acre of paddies. They get 4.5 tons. It's a different species, obviously, which is 3 times what we get from the same 1 acre. So there's a lot that we can learn and benefit from the Chinese if we are able to communicate and to have a better rapport with them as to what it is that they can do for us and we can do for them.
So I guess my final question then for you before I turn to the to audience questions is, are Chinese communities actually settling long-term in Guyana, or is it kind of I sort of imagine it as a stopping point before they go maybe, you know, they might see it as entry to other more affluent countries?
There are quite a number that I think have taken a decision because they've put down a lot of roots in Guyana. I mean, some of the infrastructure that they've invested in the form of buildings and facilities are quite significant. And I think most of the older ones have decided that they're going to stay here, the ones that have been here from the 90s. Some of the more recent ones use here as a stopgap to get the Guyanese citizenship, which they're entitled to after 7 years. And they move on to the United States or Canada because they're welcome as Guyanese as against trying to do it from China. But if you go around Guyana, as I do all the time, there are quite a significant number that have decided that they're going to stay in Guyana and make Guyana their country of residence in the future.
No, that's really heartening to hear. I mean, it would be nice to know that people are actually settling rather than, you know, moving or taking that expertise out of the country again. Now, I'm gonna just, we've got a lot of questions. I think what I'll do for now is just say thank you very much. And then I'm gonna bring all 3 of you back together so that we can maybe bring all the questions together. Do you think that sounds good, Rod? Yeah, okay, good. So yes, Stanley, if I could just say, firstly, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate that insight and for bringing us back up to modern day. So if we could put our hands together for Stanley. Yep, on gallery view, that would be fantastic. Really appreciate it. Now, let me just see if I'm not sure if I can do this, but I'm going to try and see if I can bring all 3 of you. Something didn't happen quite right there.
Mr. Peter Anderson.
I've got I've got Peter who isn't Peter. Hang on a second. I'm looking for Trev. That's who I'm looking for. I'm going to add a spotlight. There we go. Perfect. Okay. So I've now got all 3 of you in the screen, and I'm going to ask Rod to get involved at this stage because we still have over 200 people online, which means it's going to be a bit complicated going through all of the questions. And Rod, if you can maybe start us off with the first question and who it's directed to. Yeah, if you need to, you just need to unmute.
So this
Okay, that's not going to work because we're going to get reverberation between our 2 computers.
I can talk loud.
Yeah, you can talk loud.
Okay, so here we go. This first question is for Stanley. Might it be possible that we ask the ambassador to China to say a few words about the Guyana-Chinese trade and any other related topics that he may care to speak about? Is that possible?
Oh, I see. Okay. That didn't come across quite right. I think what Rod is saying is that the ambassador to China is actually in the room. And so if the ambassador to China is there, perhaps you could make yourself known, unmute yourself, And Rod will pose the question directly to you. Let me see what it was.
Just to say a few words about.
Good evening, everyone from Beijing, China.
Wonderful. Can I see? Oh, great. Yeah, I can see you, Anyin Chu. Thank you so much for joining us. And so the question was, somebody put a question in just to say, can you say a few words about the Guyana Chinese trade?
Well,
the relationships.
Thanks for putting me on the spot this evening. I know I'm not a scheduled part of the program, but I would be more than happy to, just give you a little brief on our trade with China. Traditionally, well, we've started trading with China not only yesterday, but quite a number of years ago. But recently, our top exports from Guyana to China had been mainly natural resources, timber, bauxite, and more recently, oil. And also seafood. You would be very surprised to know that we do have a list about maybe 6 to 8 Guyanese seafood companies who are presently exporting to the Chinese market. So those are our main products that come into China. For last year was the first time in a very, very long time that Guyana actually has a trade surplus with China in Guyana's favor. And that was due largely to exports of oil. I think that, we've had a quite healthy trade relationship with China over the years. We know that, a lot of our products that we import into Guyana, even the ones that we import from the US, North America, most of the products are actually produced in China. So I think that, we actually import a wide range of products from China, especially household items, clothing, small electrical appliances for homes and those kind of things. I think that what is happening right now is that Chinese investments in Guyana actually have a positive impact on our trade with Guyana. I know that Stanley mentioned that, we have a very large Chinese investment in our bauxite industry. But more recently, we've also had an added investment, which is quite large, a company by the name of Jijing, which bought over Guyana Gold Fields from the Canadian company. And so they're quite setting up on the ground to formally take over the company and operationalize the company. So I think that, our recent Chinese investments in Guyana has a positive impact on trading, on bilateral trade, that is. And also, I just want to add to what Stanley would have said earlier about, recent Chinese migrants to Guyana. Traditionally, many of the early Chinese migrants were from the Guangdong province, and many of them, by and large, over 80–90%, were involved in the restaurant business, and more recently, the recent migrants are from more from the Fujian, the Zhejiang, and from the Shandong provinces. And these are the ones that are in Guyana and have set up the big trading businesses and the various farms, and also into the other sectors also. So I think that, over the years, Chinese migrants and Chinese investments, Chinese businesses and Chinese trade in Guyana has evolved. And it would be quite interesting to see, come looking into the future in the next decade, how more it will evolve, because with the recent oil discoveries in Guyana offshore, there is quite a need for massive infrastructural development. And I think that, with China rolling out its Belt and Road Initiative, which is to provide connectivity all over the world, I think that, it is quite noticeable that recently we've had an influx of Chinese construction companies in Guyana, and they are actively bidding for infrastructural projects in Guyana. So I think that, going forward, we will see a further development and an actual shift away from the traditional sectors of involvement by the Chinese. I think that, it's interesting to note that, all the presenters here this evening, and each of them presenting on their respective areas, I think that, it was quite, all the presentations were great. They were very informative. I mean, I learned something from them too. And I think that, it's interesting to note that, many times, when we talk about Chinese migration, it's often Guyana is seen as a stepping stone to go north. I think that traditionally there's a shift in that also in recent times. I'm from a family of Chinese migrants too. My mom is first generation Chinese. My dad is Guyanese Chinese, half Chinese, half East Indian, born Guyanese. I was born in China, in Guangzhou, and I went to Guyana with my mom when I was about 2 years old. So I practically grew up in Guyana, but my siblings, they're also born in Guyana, both of them. And what we see right now is that people my age, second generation, so to speak, they're now getting into, professional sectors, surveyors, business owners, a lot of them are going to universities to get professionally qualified, And so I think that, Chinese involvement, Chinese migrants in Guyana has evolved over the years. And I think that it will be quite interesting to know that, we've had very many distinguished Chinese doctors, lawyers, we've had some politicians also. And I think that, it's just a glimpse of, how much Guyanese Chinese have contributed towards Guyana's development. And I think that, it's a prelude to more to come.
That's
That's
fascinating. Thank you, Anya. It sounds like there are multiple stories. I mean, for every person, there's sort of a different story. So there's a whole range of experiences and decisions that people make in terms of whether they stay in Guyana or go. I have to say, it was lovely hearing your background story. I love the kind of mix between China and Guyana. That's great. So yeah, I really appreciate that. Thank you. I'm going to move. You can stay spotlit because I'm sure that other questions will come up. But if I just want to go to the beginning of the chat because there were a couple of questions that came in for Trev. So if I can shift back in time again. Trev, a few people, I think Ali is saying, is asking, you mentioned that the Chinese weren't offered a return passage. Do you know why that was different for the Chinese as for, the indentured Indians were offered return passage?
Well, they were offered $50 in lieu of a return passage. And they could either take the $50 and stay and invest it locally, or they could take that and put it towards a journey back. The thing is, by the time the $50 was introduced, the cost of getting back was a lot more than $50. So it probably would have seemed better to hang on to the money and just stay on.
Yeah, and just there's two other questions that kind of interlink. So I mean, Abigail is asking, is it correct if you have 3 names, you're Chinese, but if 1 or 2 you have mixed Chinese ancestry? I think she just wanted clarification on how the names were structured.
Not always. In general, if you see 3 names that look Chinese linked together, like in Laura's case, Fung-Tin Young, well, yeah, sure, you can count on that as being fully Chinese. In other cases, there are situations where an English name has been introduced, like Evan Wong or Ewing Chow, and this those are really full Chinese, but the name got, if you will, given to or imparted upon or whatever by the local priest or
yeah, the administration
owner,
yeah.
And that became a part of the name. So it's not a clear-cut case, except for, as I say, if you see the triple Chinese sounding name, yes, for sure, that's a Chinese origin.
Okay, and if I can ask you, Laura, when you were doing your research, where in Guyana did you actually go to retrieve kind of your historical records in the archives? I'm just wondering, well, and also Trev, maybe you might want to say something about this too. I guess people just want to know, if they want to research their own families in Guyana, essentially, where do they go?
Well, I would say they should start with Trev's website, because he has digitized the Chinese ship's register, which is held in the National Archives. And I did look at it, and that was the days before digital cameras. So I had my mother scribbling down information as fast as she could. But then later, my cousin Andy Lamb, she went there with a digital camera and took photographs of every single page of the ship's register, which then Trev has now put on his website, the Chinese in Guyana, their roots, if people should look for that. And so if you know the ship that your ancestor came on, that's a good place to start, because then you can look down the list of immigrants. The thing is, the name that you know may not be the same as the name that's on the register, as Trev's explained. So then the other place was the newspaper library in Guyana. And again, I would not recommend that, mainly because it's so the newspapers are so fragile. Actually, the newspaper libraries, well, many newspapers have become digitized, but the newspaper library in London at the British Library now has the microfilm of most Chinese newspapers. The thing to start with if you're doing genealogy, and I'm sure Trev would agree with this, is to talk to all the elderly people in your family before it's too late. Find out exactly, what they remember, produce any birth certificates that they have with names on them, because that's where you have to start.
Yeah, no, Laura, if I can say just that I work in my non-Guyana Speaks life and on oral histories, and yes. I really like to encourage people to, as you say, speak to their families, but not only speak to them, record them. We really need these histories to be preserved. Yes. And there's a huge, certainly in the UK, we're finding, in terms of a lot of the migrants who came here, we don't hear enough about their histories and their experiences. And so we're sort of doing our own oral history project here, but it'd be great to see that happening in Canada and the US and everywhere else, so that, yes. We get a deeper insight into the lives of you know, that
I know,
generation.
it's very important. And another resource is, of course, the churches, because baptismal, marriage records and so on are held in all the churches. And again, my cousin Andy went and photographed all the church records that had significant Chinese congregants, because it wasn't just St. Saviour's, there were churches all over Guyana and all the Berbice and Essequibo. There were Chinese congregations in all those places where there are records that give you names of their parents, you know, and etc. And I would contact Trev if you're looking for your ancestors, because he has a huge database of Chinese names, and yeah, we're probably all related in some way. We're probably all third or fourth cousins, all the people here on these screens. You know.
I have
Juanita,
to say,
may I
Trev
say
is the
something?
guru.
May I say something?
Who's that?
May I say something? In addition to what Laura is saying, which is of course very relevant, there are also sources of research in England itself. You know,
Could you say your name so that everybody knows who's talking?
This is Robert. This is Robert. That doesn't matter. I'm just saying that in addition to local sources of information, Trev's website, what Laura is saying, etc., there are also, because Britain, you know, obviously had a colonial empire, and in various universities and government archives, there are ways to find out. I can't give details specifically right now, but you know, one can just send me an email or whatever.
Okay.
Thank you.
I thank you so much for that contribution. Can I just, one final question on this topic, if I can, is if people are trying to make the link between their first ancestor that arrived in Guyana to ancestors that may be in China, how do they make the connection? I mean, is the name that's on the ship's records, is that the name that would also you would use as a starting point in China?
The answer clearly is no.
No, okay.
Unfortunately, some of the representations in the alphabetic form do not accurately reflect where the true Chinese name. And there are complications that come in between the various dialects. That, for example, the name Wu is ng, ing, ng in another dialect. And then you can have variations where you think that you might know your origin based on the English spelling, but it might be completely wrong.
Okay, so very difficult, that sounds like.
If you know the character for your name or for the ancestor's name, then you have some chance of finding it in the Chinese records, but then Chinese records do not necessarily have records of ordinary laborers and so on. But if you might be able to find a village in the database of Chinese immigrants, it does list the village that people came from. They're now probably part of huge urban, urban areas in southern China. But if you could go to that place, there might be a family tomb or whatever that has your family name on it.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
There would have been records kept in China, and this is something I've been trying to chase down to see where they are, but they apparently don't exist anymore. And that means the contract of indenture, such as the one that I showed you, does have their Chinese name written in Chinese, and that was a great source of information for me. Here's a complication that Laura is alluding to. Her name is Fung, F-U-N-G, but we're not sure whether if it is Fung of Fung origin or Fung of Hung origin, because Hung, the Taiping king, in Hakka pronunciation is Fung. So we have people of, for example, the Fung-A-Pan family who are really Hungs. So if you see the name Fung, you don't necessarily can determine if that is truly Fung of Fung or Fung of Hung.
Oh, goodness me.
Sorry, I just want to interrupt again. Another source of information.
Sorry, Peter.
Let me just add another source of information. Lawyers have access to various websites.
I'm sorry I've muted you. It's just that we have to do this in order of the people who've asked questions. So I really appreciate your interventions, but I'll come back to you if I can. I just want to get through the questions that have already been put on the chat. So apologies for that.
Well, no apologies. I wanted to say something.
I understand that, but a lot of people have their hands up.
Well, it's not questions. It's a resource for in answer to the question that everybody's been asking,
Okay,
how they can
ahead,
find out stuff about their family. So let me just finish my sentence.
Go ahead, sir.
Lawyers have access to specialized websites where they can find records of lawsuits, and sometimes there are lawsuits in family matters that go back to the 19th century, etc. My cousin Bruce, who's a top lawyer in New York, did this exactly and found records through these lawyer websites of a lawsuit that involved our family. So that's all I wanted to say. Sorry.
Thank you.
Robert,
Thank you.
is it
It was Robert, yeah. Just before I move on, there's a lot of comments. Please feel free, everyone, to just read through what's in the chat. But I wanted to do a shout out to Ray Luck, because a lot of people have been mentioning your name. And yeah, they just wanted to say thank you for joining, Ray. So if you're there, a lot of people showing their appreciation. And
I'd love to thank Trev and Laura and Stanley for really wonderful presentations today. We all learned so much. Laura, I learned always from her about my great-great-grandfather, Fung. And thank you very much for putting on this event for all of us. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
You're welcome,
Thank you.
We appreciate you.
And then we've got, I think, a question from John Mayer. I don't know if he's still online. He says, John Mayer's always the cynical, so I'm expecting something cynical. Hang on a minute. Yeah, so he said, Stanley, I'm intrigued. The Chinese Belt and Road policy looks suspiciously to me like the European imperialists stripping the third world of raw materials. Am I mistaken or just a cynic? As I said, he's always very cynical, so trust John. Any thoughts on that? Perhaps
you want
ask Ganyin.
You want me to respond to that, Renita?
Yeah, I mean, yes, if you want to. If you don't, you don't have to.
No, well, the thing is, Renita, there's a lot of what we call in today's language being politically correct. China has 1/5 of the world's population. We know all about colonial eras and what transpired, whether it was the British, the Europeans, and the Americans. And right now, what is happening in the case of China, China recognizes that in order for them to have guaranteed supplies for their future development of raw materials, food, and various other commodities, that they have to be able to establish good linkages with most of the world, because they're 1/5 of the world. And in my humble opinion, and I try to be correct, not necessarily politically correct, I think that China has a tremendous opportunity to set a new example. And by that, I mean not going into countries promising to do this or that purely for themselves to benefit, but they have a great opportunity by sitting down and not doing what as they did in the past, which I might not sound politically correct. China, up until about 30 years ago, believed that their government should only deal with governments of countries and ignore the masses of people. And that has turned out to be an absolute disaster, because a lot of the deals that were done throughout Africa and other parts of the world, in parts of Asia, India, Pakistan, turned out to be projects that were not properly supervised, not properly conceptualized, and it ended up being a bad deal. And at the end of the day, China got the rap because they were the ones that went in and did whatever deal they did with the government. So what I would like to suggest, not just, I mean, I'm not being here presumptuous to tell China what to do, but China has a glorious opportunity now, knowing what we've gone through the last couple of centuries, being in a position where they can offer a lot of finance, technology, manpower to developing countries to go and talk with the peoples rather than just the government, work out arrangements that would be mutually beneficial and not just exploitive. And the Belt and Road Initiative, I think, was conceptualized to link all the countries of the world as possible, that we can move goods and services, peoples to all parts of the world to engage in activities, whether it is trade, whether it is in industry, natural resources, in a way that is meaningful to all the players without damaging the environment unduly. That's my opinion.
Thank you very much for that, Stanley. And because I know, would you like to come in, Anya?
I would just, if I may, I just want to also add also to the answer to that question. If you understand the concept behind the Belt and Road Initiative and the history of China, which dates back to Silk Road in the Tang Dynasty, where, you know, it was conceptualized that in order to facilitate trade globally, you have to have international connectivity. And so that was the concept behind the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think that, you know, sometimes when we look at the media and what comes through the media, I think as individuals, we need to, you know, make an assertive effort to analyze what we see on media many times. Yes, people are saying, you know, depending on which media outlet that you're paying attention to, that yes, it looks suspicious, you know, because China is offering finance to countries, you know, through the Belt and Road Initiative. But are you going to say that every country and every international organization that is offering finance for infrastructural connectivity is also should be viewed with suspicion also? I mean, I think that sometimes we need to, you know, whatever we get off the media, we need to make an assertive effort to analyze, you know, sensibly the information that we get, you know. I think that, you know, for all intents and purposes, you know, it does make sense that we now live in an age of globalization. We are connected digitally across, you know, the entire world, and physical connectivity is also a component of that globalization process. So I think that, you know, we all know the answer to the question, but, you know, as individuals, you know, we need to try to understand, you know, the concept, the rationale behind certain initiatives before we look at it through a color lens.
Thank you very much for that. Before we go on, I notice it's about 5:10, and that's 10 minutes over our usual time. I'm happy to go on, but I just wanted to make sure that the today's contributors are, if you know, you can stay at this point, or before you leave, I'd just like everybody to show their appreciation. So can I just get an indication from you whether you're okay for maybe another 20 minutes or so, or whether anybody needs to leave?
He's got to leave.
Stanley, you've got to leave?
I'm easy.
You're easy. Trev's easy.
You're
Laura,
fine.
you good? Oh, great.
Yep.
Fantastic. And you know, you good too? You're good? Perfect. So we have Galaxy S8. I think that's Mark Benchop in the room. You have a question, you said, I think, for Stanley, if you want to unmute and direct your question to him.
Thank you guys so much. Not necessarily a question for Stanley, but I'm enjoying this program thoroughly. I think Stanley touched on a few things, but as it pertains to Guyana, there's always been this perception of the Chinese who are heading to Guyana now for work-related purposes or businesses or whatever. This standoffish attitude between them and the locals. Is there any work in the making to help to make this relationship nourish so that we wouldn't see each other as enemy or as though the Chinese coming to take something or disrespecting us as Guyanese, be it African or whatever. The other thing is, what is the relationship like between the Chinese who are heading to Guyana for business or whatever, and the local Chinese? Do they have this camaraderie, this respect for each other? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Juanita, that's quite a loaded question. And let me just see if I can deal with it very relatively quickly. One of the problems that we have in Guyana between the local people and the Chinese, and even I sometimes wonder, when you look at the Chinese, when they speak to each other, it looks as almost though they're arguing and they're getting into a big argument. It's the way they speak. And that, the first time I went to China, I woke up one morning and went down to the restaurant to have breakfast. And I thought it was going to be a riot because everybody was gesticulating and shouting to the top of their voices to be heard. And I was waiting for a riot to break out. I thought it was a protest was about to start, not realizing that that's the way they speak. Maybe it's because so they can be heard,
but
the noise of the others.
Stanley, if can I interject here? Because I just want to say that's how the Caribbean community here were viewed by the English. I mean, like the way when the Windrush generation came to England, everybody here, all the white people thought all of us Black people were fighting all day long. And of course, none of us were. So it's just funny. I think it's something to do with until you become very familiar with a different culture, you misinterpret what is going on. It's very easy to misinterpret something that's just jovial or fun or whatever. And I find it fascinating, that comment and the way you see it, because I've always been fascinated by how English people here view the Black community here. And I've always been like, how is it possible they see us as arguing? But so I'm wondering if that's what it is. And as you say, because of the language difficulty, that makes it really hard. So well, I guess...
I want to add, Juanita, for the sake of Mark, because Mark and I, we've had lots of discussions on various issues of this nature. Let me just say this to you, to everybody as well. Several years ago, I wouldn't try to define whose fault it is, but when the Marriott Hotel was going to be built, whatever arrangements were made by the then government with the company Shanghai Construction entailed bringing Chinese to do everything for that project. They were here to cook, they were here to do menial jobs, portering work and stuff like that. And the Guyanese were locked out. That was not a decision that any of the local people had any control over. That was a decision made between the government of Guyana and Shanghai Construction. That sent a bad signal from the word go. I remember I was asked by a group of Chinese companies and representatives around that time to sit with them and to tell them why was there so much resentment. And I said to the guys who are the representatives of the company, whether or not the government tells you to bring everybody from China, let me ask you something. Suppose I arrive tomorrow in Beijing with 200 Guyanese and said I was coming to set up a building in China. How will the Chinese react to that? And obviously they couldn't answer. I said, irrespective of what governments tell you, especially in the case of Guyana, you need to say, look, this should not happen and we will not contribute to that, because it is not in the interest of either party, the government of Guyana nor the Chinese government. And I think from that day, it was a bad taste in the mouth of Guyanese. But since then, I've seen, and with the Sheriff Mandela project that's going on right now, and several of the other projects with the Pegasus and stuff, where the Chinese have taken the position where they will employ as many Guyanese as they can, they will train them and work alongside them. And what needs to happen is we need to step back from what our position was then and look at what is happening now and recognize that the Chinese want to do business. They want to see that countries like Guyana, who have a lot to offer, not just to China, but to the world in terms of resources, They want to be friends. I've never met any Chinese over the last 30 odd years that I found personally hostile. I mean, when they talk amongst themselves in my presence, I think maybe they're cursing me or something, but that's the way they are, right? But we need to be more patient. I know in the case of Jamaica has benefited big time from Chinese technology and investments within the last decade or so. And what the Jamaicans are saying, they are more suspicious of their politicians trying to maneuver whatever contracts it is in their interest. And they cannot blame the Chinese government or the Chinese representatives to looking after Chinese interests. So what we have to do in the case of Guyana, our politicians and our people must stand up for what we think it is in our interest. And to put our foot down and say to the politicians, hey, you can't say that only Chinese must come to do this project because you want it done in 1 year rather than if Guyanese were involved, it would take 1.5 years. We have to accept that we are a developing country. We are not, within the last 30 years, the Chinese have developed significantly, their education, their attitudes. Our people will have to be given, even if it's double the time, to work along with them. It will cost a little bit more, but that's what needs to be done. You cannot take the Guyanese and treat them as second-class citizens in our own country. We have to feel that we are a part of the decision-making process, and we are a part of whatever decisions are to be taken for future arrangement between China and Guyana, not politicians.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Stanley. If I can, I'd like to, I see Holly Stevens has had her hand up for a long while. I don't know if Holly's there because I can't see her in the view. So I'm going to go, Holly, if you're there, I'm coming back to you. I'm going to go to Stephanie Jones first, and then I'll come back to Holly, and then I'll go to Kwesi.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Stephanie.
Thank you, first of all, for doing the presentation. I really appreciate listening to all of you speak. I was more focused on what Laura was saying, but then she got caught off. The fact that I'm finding that all the Chinese people that came over during the 1860s, we're all sort of related, as she was saying, we've all found distance, we're all married into cousins, and we're all cousins, and we all seem very related to each other. And I wanted to know how we could find how we are all related. I'm just saying, because I've been doing the research, I've been trying to figure it out. I know this one of my distant aunts named Pam Dower, she's also trying to find, and the Cheataos are linked with the Youngs and the Yus, all of us are all, and the Sue-A-Quans, all of us are all linked together. And I wanted to know how we could find this family tree, which isn't a tree, it's a bush.
Yeah, really. It's a tangled bush. Yeah. Mm-hmm. One of the things some people have done, I'm not a great proponent, but it has yielded results, which is DNA tests. Now that depends on other people in your tangled web having done DNA tests. But I know that some people have found some surprising results where they discover that they're cousins with somebody. That's only good if you have some kind of family tree to link that to. If you find out that you're second cousins with, Arthur Chung, the late president, you would need to know both your family trees to know how you're actually related. So there isn't an easy way to do that. I mean, you have to build your family tree. Trev is very good at helping people do that. I know he has tons of communications going on with that. Genealogy is not my forte, but genealogy is very useful for teasing out stories about the past. And when I looked at property records, for example, the official gazette for British Guiana, many of the official gazettes you can find free online through the Hathi, H-A-T-H-I, Hathi website. So the official gazettes from about 1900 to 1920, you can find free online. and type in the names of people you're looking for. Now, it's very tedious and it can take a while for it to load and all that. But, you know, if you type in Fung, there's you know, you'll get 100 hits maybe, and half of them are not your Fung, etc. But sometimes the property records will have something in probate, and that's where I find interesting information, because it'll say, you know, John Ho-Ten Pao, and then it'll list his brothers and sisters or his children, or you know, Fung Tin Young, and leaves it to, you know, his properties are being divided between, and it'll list a whole bunch of relatives, or you can figure out from that who's related. There's no direct way, but I make associations often by sort of triangulating information. I would see, say, a reference to, I'm looking for Fung Tin Young, Isaac. So I type in questions for Yong, FT Yong, knowing that he was sometimes referred to as that name back in the early 20th century. So it's definitely not easy. It's very tedious, but it's just building bit by bit the picture, and I can't give you an easy way to do it. DNA is sort of a shortcut, but not necessarily going to tell you everything, because you need to know something to hinge that DNA story onto. I don't know if that helps.
Thank you.
I can just add to what Laura said. So what I've discovered is that, you know, over the years, you know, in Guyana, when you apply for a birth certificate, you know, you have to write the child's name, and then you have to write the father's name separate. And what I found is that what has happened in that a lot of the Chinese immigrants that came to Guyana, what they did was that for the surname, they actually put the father's entire name on that certificate, on the birth certificate. So for example, if the child's name is Vincent and the surname is, let's say, Tao Young, it means that Tao Young was actually the father's whole name, and the father's surname was just Young alone. So we have that happening also. I mean, it still happens now, because I've literally had to help a couple of people, well, Chinese nationals actually, who've had kids born in Guyana fill up their birth certificate application, because lots of them make the mistake of just putting in the father's entire name as the surname. But what I also know that if you know what the surname is in Chinese of your ancestors, I mean, if you're trying to locate which part of China you're from, and if you still have relatives there, if you know your surname in Chinese, I think that helps, because what happened is that, what I found is that many times if you have a surname that is similar with someone else in the same country, most likely you came from the same village and you're related, and you probably have the same ancestors also. So I think that's probably one of the ways that you can try and sort out the bush also.
Thank you for that contribution there. And in connection to that, Ali's actually put a question in here saying, where is the surname Teixeira from? Is it Chinese or Portuguese? And I wanted to mention that we did do an event on the Portuguese last month. And Teixeira is not a Chinese name, it would be Portuguese. So for anyone who wants to see previous Guyana Speaks events, of course, they're recorded and they're on the Guyana Speaks YouTube page. So you literally need to go into YouTube, just Google, go into our YouTube channel, look for Guyana Speaks, and then you'll just see a list of all the different programs and you can watch what you're interested in. And obviously this event will also be added to what's already there. So just to reassure you all, it is being recorded and will be saved. And I just wanted to bring in as well, Cynthia, Cynthia, forgive me if I'm saying your surname incorrectly, Staworski, has said, Trev, Errol and Wendy, my aunt says, hello from the Jansons. So I see a nod from Trev, so he knows. The other thing was, Trev actually put his email address in there, or somebody, I think somebody shared Trev's email address, and I hope that's okay with you, Trev. But so I think if anybody has particular questions on research, I would suggest you firstly go to his website, and he may be able to help with other questions. I'll add Trev's website to the Guyana Speaks Facebook page so that you've got a quick and easy reference to it there. And then we've got a long question here from Michael Ewing Chow, who says, I think this is this for Trev? I think this is for Trev, but probably Laura too. Based on his research in East Asia and particularly Southeast Asia, Professor Wang Gongwu suggests that all Chinese immigration was just sojourning with an intention to return to China. Trev, would this be true of the Chinese who migrated to Guyana? Would the change in the religion of the Chinese who migrated to China have changed the mindset of the Chinese migrants?
No. There were occasions where some people were offered, let's call it a trip to Guyana with the thought that they might be able to get back to China. But I think this represents a minority of situations. As I had outlined earlier, the situation in the early emigration movement was that people were being taken off the streets. You know, the term Shanghai is actually the reverse of this. When in that period of time, in London, in Liverpool, and the west coast of United States, like Seattle and Portland and San Francisco, they were short of able-bodied men to be able to man the ships. So they just borrowed them off the streets, put them on the ships, and they find themselves ending up in Shanghai. So that's where the word Shanghai comes from, the term, I should say, the verb. But it's the reverse in China. The people in China that were taken out as coolies weren't necessarily willing to go in the first place or knowing that they were going anywhere. In some cases, they were taken for a boat ride. Let's go for a ride on the boat, and they find themselves on a foreign ship. So it's all sorts of situations, pleasant and unpleasant. I do know that, for example, the Christian community that were converts in the later years, they were willing immigrants, especially when the Qing government, which were persecuted, the Qing was the government in power in Beijing, were persecuting the Taipings, the remnants of the Taipings, and the thought in those days was that you had to eliminate 3 or even 5 generations of people if you were associated with, let's say, the Fung clan. So they would go to a village and eliminate all these people. So these families became potential immigrants because they were escaping a situation in China that was unprecedented.
I see, fascinating. Thank you for that. I'm just going to move quickly to Kwesi. Kwesi's had his hand up for a little while. So Kwesi, if you're there, please unmute.
Hi, thanks so much for this. This was really interesting to listen. I have 2 quick questions and then a comment. So I guess the comment is first to agree with Stanley. My children are half Chinese, half Vietnamese, and in the middle of the night, I run down many times thinking that they're in a fight with their grandmother, only to find out that they're sharing recipes, and destiny is perhaps the first thing that comes out her mouth whenever she sees them. The second 2 points are questions really to Trevor. The first is around basically religion and Chinese immigrants in Guyana in particular. So we've had retention of Hinduism and Islam around Indian immigrants. In Suriname, you've had retention of Islam with Javanese immigrants. We haven't had the same with Chinese in either of these two countries. I'm wondering how much of that has to do with the fact that Buddhism in China was more of a monastic religion. Confucianism was a set of practices. So was this something that you couldn't take with you because you didn't have an organized setup when you arrived in Guyana to fit into? Or what's the difference there? And the second, again, is a comparison with the East Indian community, where you have in Guyana a very strong, as Stanley said, Chowmin, where you don't see very big distinctions between Madrasis, Afghans, Biharis in Guyana. But if you go to places like Mauritius or to South Africa, these communities are still very separate. Southern Indians have their own traditions, their own cuisine, still speak Telugu or Tamil. Northern Indians are very different. But in Guyana, you've had Cantonese speakers, Fujian, you've had Haga, all blending into a single community. What would you say were the reasons for these two phenomena? The blending of Chinese in Guyana and the loss of religion. And again, thanks so much for this. This was really, really, really interesting.
Well, thanks for that question. I think, as I mentioned, the 3M approach, the merchants backed by the mission, by the military, and then the introduction of missionaries did have, as far as the Chinese immigration is concerned, did have a strong effect. Now, in general, the effect of these missionaries were to get Christian converts or people who would be readily associated with them to go to Guyana. And maybe Laura, she's done a lot about effect of religion on the Chinese community. Can add to this. The other aspect about the melting pot, if you will, of people coming from various areas and having different religions or different what sects or so forth, but becoming a different community or more cohesive community, not necessarily strongly attached to one aspect or another of a religious belief. So it became, oh, we're all here together, we might as well work together. So those differences tended to be reduced. I'll ask Laura if she can comment on the religious thing.
Yes, not just religion, but also language. I think one of the factors in lessening the transmission of Chinese traditions was also that the Chinese who came in that immigration came from different linguistic groups, the Hakka and Cantonese, and some, what's the other third linguistic group? Trev, I've forgotten. But anyway, their common language would have been English. Because you don't have a lot of choice of husbands and wives. There were a limited number of women. So if you wanted to marry have a Chinese spouse, it's quite likely they didn't speak the same language as you. So the second generation of Chinese quickly lost or did not speak their ancestral language. They also, after they left the plantations, the Chinese merchants, those who did not already come as Christians, which a lot of them did, on the Dartmouth in particular, and then in some of the early ships, there was a whole bunch of Chinese who were recommended by a missionary called Reverend Lobsheed in Hong Kong. But it seems that, as Stephanie was suggesting, many of these people were connected in some ways. They might have known that some relative went to Guyana, but I can't speak specifically about why Buddhism didn't have such a hold on them when they got to Guyana. But I think many of those who found that the church provided a sort of entree into the middle class. My dissertation subtitle was Chinese in Guyana, the Creolization of the Chinese, because I was interested in how the Chinese became so quickly absorbed into the Guyanese population. By 1920s, you had riots in Jamaica against anti-Chinese riots in Jamaica, but not in Guyana. And that was the same throughout the Chinese diaspora. There were a lot of prejudices against the Chinese. But I think the fact that the Chinese were seen sort of culturally pretty much like the rest of the population helped their integration enormously, and then being members of the church. So because they did not, although they segregated by family, often preferring to marry other Chinese, is in the early days, they were seen as pretty much like the Afro-Guyanese in terms of belonging to a church. They formed similar associations. They had their own Masonic association. It was the Chinese Masonic Association, but apparently, according to Marlene Crawford's book, they were not welcome in the one that was formed by the Afro-Guyanese middle class. So they formed their own association. That's a long answer. I don't know if it answers specifically about religion, but you can see that I don't know of anyone who retained Chinese religion. I know contemporarily some of my relatives have taken up Buddhism, but that's not in connection with our previous religion. It's a more contemporary choice.
Thank you, Laura. That's fantastic. I think because time is pushing on, we will round up. But just before we go and before we thank our speakers, I wanted to bring Scott Tingaky in. Scott is somewhere online here, somewhere. Scott is the author of a book called Red Hibiscus, and that was published fairly recently, maybe 2 years ago now, or I don't know. But Scott, if you're there, can you, Trevor's pointing at something, maybe he's got your book, I don't know. Scott,
No,
are you still there?
It's my hibiscus.
It's your hibiscus, of course. Fantastic. I just guess if Scott is in, I don't think he is, but I just wanted him to say something about his book because he brings in a lot of the history of China into his book. It's a sort of like, it's quite poetic in its structure, and it's fascinating. So I thought he might say something, but he doesn't appear to be there.
I'm here.
Oh, you are! Yay! Yeah, you had a question and a comment or something as well, Scott, that was in the chat, which you might want to relay. But could you just say something for people who don't know about your book? Could you share something about it?
Sure. Red Hibiscus is my debut novella. As Vinita mentioned before, it's a mixture of prose and poetry, and it's really an attempt to bring historical fiction within Caribbean literature, where I have the three protagonists who are all, well, two high priestesses, and one is a high priest within the traditional Chinese folk religion, and it's set mostly in ancient China. And they see visions of the future in terms of colonialism and what it will bring. But because it's so far into the future, they don't really understand what it means, because this is a time where guns and so on don't exist. So it's really them trying to make sense of the future that they're seeing while battling different mythical creatures, and sometimes even gods get involved, because the idea of seeing so far into the future, it ruins the idea of having a balance that is needed. So the yin yang is a big symbol in the book, as well as the red hibiscus. And about the title of the book being Red Hibiscus, the reason why I chose the title Red Hibiscus is because in Caribbean literature, the red hibiscus is a symbol of the Caribbean. Additionally, it is also a flower that is native to the southern region of China. So there's this connection through the red hibiscus between ancient China and the Caribbean.
Thank you very much for that. That's Scott Tingaky. And so, yeah, good to support our local literary, our local writers and authors. So I believe your book is available on Amazon. It was published by Michelle Santua of Way with Words. And so I'll put that on our Facebook page as well, just as a reminder if you want to find out where to get the book. I'm guessing most people will have access to the Guyana Speaks Facebook page already, and that's probably how you found out about the event. So pretty much everything relating to this event, I will be posting on there. But if we can just please put our hands together for everybody that contributed, for Stanley Ming, Laura Hall, Trev Sue-A-Quan, and also to Anyin Chu. I really appreciate your contributing today. It's been fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Juanita, for organizing it. It's really been great to see all these faces too.
Yeah, I have to say, we made 206, which is a record for Guyana Speaks. So yeah, it's obviously a subject that needed to be covered, and you know, that people have an interest in, but probably haven't known where to go to find out about it. So you've all been really, truly amazing. So thank you so much. Sometimes some people want to just break free now. I'm going to take the recording off. Stop recording. Hang on.